Hey there, welcome to episode 59 of the Let's Innovate for Vegas audio program. I am your host, Managing Director of the Innovate for Vegas Foundation, Dan Hugo. We are recording this in the middle of the day on Friday, April 5, 2024. Open source in the news. If you've been paying attention at all, and you may not have been, open source has been in the news somewhat lately, more than normal, for some not great things. Not all of it's great, as I say, so we are still all in on open source development for our organization, plus a little bit of Creative Commons, but we do need to pay attention and know the ins and outs, and you should know too. If you have found this audio program in the usual places, ideally there will be a description of the audio episode 59, and you will be able to see these links. We are inches away at this point. I am working on some things to enable all of my programs, but as part of our My Muni project, more smart social, I think, but the ability to find podcasters, content creators, influencers in and adjacent to the greater Vegas area, sort of like an index, but not just for podcasts. But that said, we really want to be found on our website. And this is true of my other productions as well. Rather than handing our content over to Spotify or Google Podcasts just shut down, which is a minor news item. Rather than depending completely on being found via Google Podcasts or Apple iTunes or Spotify, Amazon Music, those are fine. Those should continue to exist, and we should continue to publish to those or try to be found in more places. Being found in more places is usually okay. But we really want to own our presence. So the posse, publish on your own servers, syndicate everywhere. It's a good idea. So we'll look for that. But in the meantime, hopefully you can see the links. If you're listening to this program long after, hopefully like more than a week, but not this will be true sooner than years later. But if you're listening to this in the future, after April 2024, hopefully the links will also include, or somewhere in the episode description, there will be a link to the official, authoritative place where you can find our audio programs, including this one. So the links include, as usual, a link to our main website, innovateforvegas.org. That should be where you begin your quest for our primary self-owned publication point for all of our programming, more information about projects and so on, and our GitHub org, which is also Innovate for Vegas, github.com/innovateforvegas, where our project repositories are. Those are good starting points. Here today, open source in the news, you may not have heard of the Open Tofu project, and that's okay. Maybe it's better that people don't hear about this. So the Open Tofu project is a fork, and some of these terms may not be familiar to you, a fork of the HashiCorp Terraform project to keep it an open source compliant, as far as license goes, project. And so they took the last open source compliant revision to the Terraform platform, I guess, tools. They forked it, and the Linux Foundation is supporting continuation of the development of the open source version of HashiCorp's Terraform, and we'll get to the relicensing in a link coming up shortly. I put this link here because if you read the article, the thing about when you fork, if you're familiar with what a clean room is, if you're going to take open source software and fork it to continue the open source development of it while the original maybe, and as is the case here, changes its licensing terms so that it's not open source compliant anymore, a so-called source available license or other, so that you're not free to make modifications and include them in your products and so on and so on. It's a little bit inside baseball, but still important. It's an important thing to understand if you are in this world. If you've ever used music in your TikTok video, or if you've ever copied, excerpted a movie or an audio or written word passage and you've used it incorrectly, you may have violated the license terms. You may have become familiar with these things through that route. In general, being familiar with what you're allowed to do according to the publisher, the owner of the thing, whatever it is, it's important to know these things. So in this case, this article is about how someone, and you can read the article and you can do a deep dive if you want, may have taken some code from the post-fork Terraform repository incorrectly, inappropriately, to implement a feature to try to maintain feature parity. You can try to maintain feature parity. You should not do so by copying and pasting elements that are not compliant with the current license. So that is something to be aware of. I have another article here, ours on the Redis relicense. So OpenTofu is the result of HashiCorp changing the licenses of all of its platform products, right? So Terraform, Console, Vault, I think is one of my favorites, Vagrant, Packer, I think there are a few more. So they've changed their licenses mostly as a defensive action so that other companies aren't making money on their work without participating financially in supporting the work. It's very tempting to build an entire business on the free work of others. That is the nature of open source. There have been extremely insightful graphics about the entire world being held up by a 2x4 maintained by one guy in a basement or something like that. So the challenge is real to enable and encourage continuation and new open source development. It's a sign of the times, but it's also something of a rug pull. We'll get to that. So ours on the Redis relicensing. Redis is I can't remember what Redis stands for. I just heard it. It's something dictionary server, and I cannot remember what the re is. Anyway, it's essentially a key value store, usually in memory, can sync to disk, but you basically will find every website on the universe uses something like Redis to cache, to speed up their website response. So rather than doing a database search to build up a document to get usernames and comments and icons and stuff, they do that once and they cache the elements of the view that they're going to build, or whatever their caching scheme is. And they'll use something like Redis or Elastic Cache or Cassandra, maybe, who knows. The key value is a nice way to accelerate. It basically is mimicking a hash table. So give me this based on that. Much simpler query scheme than SQL database. So you'll find Redis or similar in use all over the place. So when Redis relicenses to a source available license, no longer open source compatible, you're going to see several companies, several projects out of necessity pulling back from the support of Redis or the use of Redis or the commercialization of Redis, and similar motivation. But the story of Redis is storied. It's worth looking into. Probably a bad smell to this, more of a rug pull. The HashiCorp thing, probably less stinky, but still sort of troubling. It's happened enough times. The business model, one of the business models, is reasonably clear, and that's the next link. The Linux Foundation gets behind the val key, so key value store, val key, VALKEY, fork of Redis. So the Linux Foundation, fun fact, was formed to enable the sustainable development efforts and continued development efforts in a sustainable way of the Linux kernel and various other projects. So if you're building open source software and giving it away for free, I am often one to quote the Saturday Night Live fun commercial about the change bank. It's a bank that only gives change, so they take no commissions, no fees, etc. So you cannot make money. So at the end of one of the two, it's a two-parter, the bank manager is being interviewed in a black background, stylized interview scheme. And they say, I'm often asked, how do you make money? And the answer is simple: volume. So the more people using your open source project for free, the better, or maybe not. So the Linux Foundation enables the capture of donations and funding, promotes the availability of these channels to continue effort, does some marketing and so on. So the Linux Foundation as a business entity helps to enable the continued development of this open source project. The Linux kernel is published under the GPL version 2, which we'll get into later. And so it's open source. It's available. You can build on it. As long as you tell people where you got it, who's working on it. So transparently using the Linux kernel, as long as you are able to comply with the license terms with whatever you change or add to it. And there's a whole tainted module scheme to enable proprietary, video drivers, I think was the impetus for that. Get that video card working with acceleration, technically graphics cards. But end of the day, there is a business model that can work with free software. You have to have a certain amount of interest and momentum. You can start off thinking that you will be the next pen and sliced bread put together, which Redis has sort of evolved into. If you start out with that assumption and you are transparent about, like, hey, in order to continue developing this, we need to have some sort of revenue stream to support development. It's become a critical component of the internet infrastructure. You have a business case to make for sustainable operation. What HashiCorp actually offered a cloud service. They offered enterprise tiers. So the fact that they changed their license may just say that they planned incorrectly, or maybe it's just plain old greed. Like, how come we're letting people build on our stuff for free? We should be taking all of the money. Maybe that's my assumption. I believe in the long tail, so there is a value proposition that can work. Something like the Linux Foundation is interesting. We'll see how the Valkey fork of Redis goes, but the fact that the Linux Foundation is also backing OpenTofu, which has already run afoul of what the ethics, what the ethos of the open source community is, especially when dealing with open source license versus not open source license, mixing of code. I do have I'll get to that in a second. HashiCorp relicensing kicks off a recent debate and a fork. So the sort of origin story of OpenTofu, and when HashiCorp rocked the internet by saying, you're not going to be able to use this stuff for free. What often gets taken from that is that I'm not allowed to use your stuff anymore. And that's not exactly what that means. It means you're not allowed to build a business on top of our stuff for free. If you look at how OpenAI works, you can use some things for free. You have to pay for other things. And they start off in that direction. So there's really no big surprise that people have to realize the resources that are behind something like OpenAI. They may be wasteful, ridiculous amounts of energy being consumed. But the fact is, if you hide those, if you do we'll lose money for a while and then we'll pivot and suddenly draw money out of the pockets of those who've come to depend on us. The Uber model, right? Put the local cab companies out of business, and then they have to use our services at twice the price with a smile on their face, and we'll pay the drivers less, et cetera, et cetera. So the open source world is supposed to be a little bit more transparent by its very nature. So we'll see how these things shake out. But it is interesting to see how open source is dealing with certain things and how it might be evolving and how attitudes towards it are evolving, because it is it's an absolutely critical component of technology development. Open source has enabled you in more ways than you can even imagine, from mobile phone to computers to cloud services to websites to development tools that enable those things to actual products and services to educational. Anybody getting in tech is going to touch open source. They'll be playing with an Arduino or a Raspberry Pi or something similar at some point, using open source software, benefiting beyond imagination from the efforts of so many people. As Isaac Newton was wont to say, if I have seen further, it is because I stand on the shoulders of giants, and those are people developing in the open source world. And not everything has to be software. So the Creative Commons license applies in many cases to creative works like logos or artwork or the written word, more human read or seen elements, Creative Commons, copyleft, etc. There are a number of ways to contribute your creative works to the greater good without feeling as though you are losing any rights to them. So there was recently an XZ, which is a compression scheme. Sort of, if you know what zip is, if you ever see a zip file, you might see in your travels a .xz, X-ray Zulu file. That's a different type of compression scheme. There's GZ, the GNU zip format. So zip, .gz. Back in the old days, there was compress. There were some others. So the XZ utils package got a backdoor inserted into it, something of a wake-up call, but also a flashlight that can shine some light on some things that always should be at the fore in consideration of how you use these tools and how people get credit for them. Essentially, the XZ maintainer was tired. So the person that was making contributions and doing a little bit of social engineering was able to take over and inserted some code as a binary into the output, the built artifact of the XZ utils, which was then drawn into as a latest release into some Linux distributions, and XZ utils version 5.6 and 0.0 and 5.6.1 affected by this. Most, if not all, rollbacks have taken place at this point, and so that should be fine. But the path that got us here, and I do mean us, because everyone who blindly does updates or doesn't ponder security implications of who's developing what and what you depend on and what has access to your system and what gets root, the added bonus vulnerability introduced in SSH because of this, adding vulnerability, privilege escalation possibilities, and so on. So on the upside, open source, being transparent as it is, enables people to very quickly determine, what happened. Here's the source code. Here are the commits. Here's exactly where we need to roll back to. These things are a lot easier when you don't have to wonder as much. So things done in the open are not less secure, as some rumors might suggest. However, the flashlight that needs to shine on all of this should be illuminating the fact that we cannot have one person responsible for the security of the world. And this happens way too much. So open source development is critical, but also undervalued, severely undervalued. And this is true of so many people. Anyone who was around for the pandemic lockdowns, anybody? The essential workers. Well, guess what open source developers are, especially if they're working on critical infrastructure that everyone uses. So essential workers, never fully appreciated, and often more critical than they're recognized for, only realize when they disappear. When they get burnt out, when they get tired, or when they, unfortunately, some things happen and they leave, illness, accidents, etc. So the upside is that this is getting more attention now, that the fact that open source developers, people who do these things and make material contributions for the greater good, need to be accounted for. They need to be accountable, but they need to be accounted for. The business model of the individual is lost in the politics of who's funding the fork. Amazon is going to help get the Redis fork up and running because Redis Redis is a thing that everybody uses on Amazon Web Services. But if we can't use it anymore, if we can't offer it as an element of the collection of services, then what are we going to do? We'll just pay a competing open source compatible thing. So it's a little capitalist effort. But at the end of the day, there are people, there are actual human beings working on these things, and they need to be recognized. They need to be appreciated in some way, financially or otherwise. And when that breaks down, real drama can unfold. And we've seen that with the XC utils. Finally, I have a link to the Linux kernel licensing rules if you're curious. So it details, it's version 4.18. I don't know if there's a later version. Hopefully they didn't have like a latest, and I didn't see a date for the date of last revision of this, but either way, it's a good example, if nothing else, of how a license is specified and how compatible licenses are specified and so on. So the Linux kernel continues to be released under GPL v2, but there are compatible licenses that can be applied to kernel modules and other contributions. The kernel contributor list is long and storied. And so yeah, open source works as long as people are willing to participate and do so ethically and for the right reasons. And sometimes one of those reasons is your company is paying you to do it. At Intel, there were countless open source contributors to anything from the Linux kernel to video drivers to more. They received a salary from the company. The work that we did in the Maker Innovator Group was released open source. We had to sign an attestation document that we had contributed this work on behalf of Intel without using outside or inappropriate copies or theft of other intellectual properties and so on and so on. So everything had the proper headers attached and the licensing and so on. So sometimes it is actual financial, like a paycheck or other financial support like that. Sometimes it's just knowing that, hey, one person is doing all this work. Why don't they get named if they want? So if you ever wonder why I'm a strong proponent of attribution for open source, or more to the point, civic volunteer efforts, contribution of not only creative work, but creative effort, it's important. It's important that people who do things get something for it. That's how the world works. So the ethos and the license, why participate in and perhaps contribute to open source projects. I sort of touched on that. It has to come from within sometimes. Like, I want to do something, maybe to give back. I benefit from open source software. Maybe I should write something or contribute something I've written or created in a similar vein so that others, perhaps the people from whom I am drawing so much benefit, could benefit as well. So it's a circular marketplace of sorts. Who gets the benefit of your work sooner and then long after is often, and one of the reasons for the license, it's spelled out in the license, right? So who gets to copy things, attribution, visibility of the history of a particular project and its components. You don't always see this with some creative works. Often you will hear tales of woe, and I'm not being condescending. Artists, photographers, musicians, etc. They will find snippets, they will find clips, they will find samples, they will find their works lifted wholesale and appearing in advertisements or in other artwork or other things. Slightly more difficult with a sculpture, a physical piece of art, but we do live in a digital age. So who gets to use your stuff? The copyright, the trademark, the patent. These are rooted in old school legal and procedural cultural behaviors. The future with open source and with licensing, you can copy that, or Creative Commons with attribution and no derivative. Yeah, you can have derivative works or not. You have to give attribution or not. It's if you spell those things out and someone violates them, it's sort of it becomes a major headache. But if you are one who becomes known for violating these things, hopefully that's a reflection on you or your company, and the larger community will recognize that things like this open tofu scenario, the rules are in place, and if we follow them, everything works. When you stop doing that, things go awry. When a license changes, it can be considered by some to be a rug pull, and it sometimes is. And the Redis situation is a great example. So I would encourage you to read about the history of Redis, the founder, the company that eventually hired him. They wanted to rename themselves to, which they eventually did, Redis Labs, and then they just went with Redis. So they kind of took over the name and the place in society, and the fact that everybody was using Redis for their cache implementations and so on. Sort of a long play. I think it's 15 years ago Redis started, became a thing. So 15 years ago to now, it's the longest of long cons, but there have been longer ones. To rug pull is frustrating and disappointing and so on. But it's basically, now that we've got everybody using our stuff, we'll pull the rug out from under them, and now they're going to have to pay, or the finer points are a little bit more complicated than that. But, hey, we got them all hooked. Now is when we can start making some real money. And if you look at some of the budgets for Redis Labs, now Redis, if you look at some of the money that's being spent, if you look at how Mongo did something similar, that Redis has moved to a Mongo-ish source available license. The amount of money that these companies are spending on marketing and sales and so on, it's just crazy. It's something to think about in general. But I think you have to be astute when you are getting into the business of open source product and software and services that are dependent on those things, development and support and innovation and continued innovation and so on. So you kind of have to pay attention to what's needed to maintain that. And maybe something like a Linux Foundation model makes sense, or maybe an Innovate for Vegas Foundation model. Value for value. As I often tell people, I don't want you to work for free, but I want you to be willing to work for free. There's the ethos of civic volunteerism and open source, open development, enabling people to use your contributions to the greater good for other greater good in a compliant, in a license-friendly way is important to keep the machinery running, but you also have bills to pay. So a business model that wraps an open source model is something to think about as early as possible. And if you have something like a BSD license, which was the case for Redis, the three clause license, or an MIT or Apache has some interesting licensing. So there are some that are very permissive. There are some that are a little bit more restrictive. It's important to know the full spectrum of licenses and how they all fit together, which is a full-time job in itself. They should send people to a special school to learn about such things. Each project repository, and this applies everywhere, but it certainly applies for our projects, can and should have a license applied to its contributions. So the GitHub, and I think GitLab, but GitHub certainly, you can have a license. You can pick from a drop-down menu of options for popular licenses, but there are any number of them. You include a license file at the top of your, immediately top level directory of your repository, so that anyone who forks it or clones it or views it knows exactly where to look for the well-known location of the license file. And then every file that is in the repository should, where possible, have a header. The first part of the file at the very top should spell out the licensing terms of what project is this a part of, and the licensing terms and so on. So there should be pretty obvious clarity when you touch a piece of open source, or when you touch a piece of software that's licensed, or a creative work that's licensed, so that you can tell what you're allowed to do with it. We have started off with GPL v3, which I will get to in a moment, mostly out of respect for the civic volunteers who will contribute their time, so that there's no immediate concern that someone could take a BSD licensed, for example, project and commercialize it, and someone who contributed for a couple of weeks or months and then maybe had to go off to school or got a job somewhere else or whatever the circumstance, says, hey, I guess I don't get to participate in the continued success, which you don't automatically get to do anyway. But the feeling that you contributed something and then someone else is profiting from it is not always easy. Some people are fine with that. It absolutely depends on the circumstance and the individual. I'm mostly fine with that. Although for the sake of people volunteering their time who may be, especially starting out in their careers, full attribution and transparency, I think the GPL v3, certainly for our core components, makes sense. are other, as we roll out more things, as more people participate, there may be cases to be made for other licensing. There's always multiple licenses, dual or more perhaps, which can be tricky. There are a variety of ways to go, but checking compatibility between licensed components and completely different projects from different organizations could be problematic because of the way our core components are architected so far. There should be no interdependency for license complications, so that one can call the other remotely through a service call, but not be linked. So you're not facing the link problem or the link consideration. It's not really a problem, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot to think about, but there's always transparency and the possibility of creating new projects with applicable licenses according to the people that are going to work on them, as well as future considerations and the overall business model of, in this case, the Innovate for Vegas Foundation. So the GPL is often called viral or evil. It's not really. It depends on if you look at the world through a money lens or a greater good lens, and then you do something like what the Linux kernel people have done with the Linux Foundation. So if you think ahead, or if you make use of your momentum and your reach, right? If everybody knows the Linux kernel, well, here's what we're doing. Here's a way that we can sustain the development of the Linux kernel. We're not asking you to pay license fees for, you continue to use the thing you've been using. And by the way, speaking of license fees, you can look at the Unity developer platform, total chaos, which will only make Godot or Godot, if you like, the Godot platform and similar, get a little bit more attention on them. But when you change the term such that now the thing that was free or mostly free now requires more, individual license fees or per seat, as they call them. So every time someone installs your software, you have to pay us money. Every time somebody installs your game, you have to pay us money. That can start eating into your finances pretty quickly if you're a small company. So if you were a small company and said, hey, let's base our product on the Linux kernel, and you release your sources because you say, hey, here is our GPL v2 compliant wrappers around the kernel, or however you've constructed your products and services, you are completely compliant with the license, and you say to the world, hey, by the way, we're selling you a piece of hardware that's benefiting from the many giants upon whose shoulders we stand. You have to buy the hardware, but there is an extra $10 that flows through us to these other services. Not required, but you can make a donation to a foundation. You can support a project. You can support an individual. If you are cognizant of that money flow, of that financial support pathway, perhaps we would see more people that are benefiting not from give me money, but from appreciation, value for value. I did it for the greater good, but I also get to benefit in some way because people recognize that. That's good. That can work. So if we work with GPL-v3 and we can work with other licenses that are compliant, and if we eventually release our powered by Innovate for Vegas Foundation civic volunteers, or if we collaborate with other organizations that are performing similar tasks, if they're releasing components under open source licenses that are compatible, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, then we accomplish our goals. We are not a software development company, so we are not necessarily looking to turn open source project development efforts into profit centers. However, people who volunteer their time, like I said, should be willing to volunteer their time to work for free, but they should not have to work for free. They should be eligible. They are entitled to some sort of recognition, financial compensation or otherwise. So that should be enabled and it should be encouraged. The Linux Foundation supports the business side of the Linux kernel and sustaining the projects and efforts around it. And that includes other sort of adjacent projects like OpenTofu, like Valkey, and others. These are in the news, so I mentioned them, but you can check out the Linux Foundation website. In general, that's something we'll probably talk about in another episode, especially when we deploy. Our first project will be the MyMuni platform, when we deploy it as a sort of a beta implementation powered by the importance of where the Innovate for Vegas Foundation and its contribution to the deployment of a functioning platform, right? Hey, our civic volunteers are spending their volunteer time building open source tools released under this license that are enabling this platform as a separate entity, a deployment and implementation of our efforts that can make money. That thing is a separate separate implementation, entity, deployment. They got ads, they're paying their employees, whatever. Doesn't matter. They do what they're going to do. They're powered by open source projects and open source contribution efforts. And there's a clear financial support pathway that can be espoused by the deployment platform. And this will almost definitely be the subject of more episodes into the future. But the path to supporting open source development in a value for value model rather than a forced license fee model is really something to think about. It enables people who don't, and you'll hear this from some podcasters who want to charge money for their podcast. You will often hear them say very explicitly, if you cannot afford to spend $5 a month for whatever reason, and the good ones don't ask for a reason. They want you to listen. They want to pay their own bills. But if you are unable to add that $5 a month to your own budget, and this starts to add up when you take a top view of the top level view of the world, and you say, hey, oh, if you're subscribing to 5 podcasts, that's $25 a month. That's not just $5. So the cool podcast producers, content creators out there will often say, if you can't afford that, say so. Just say, hey, I want to subscribe to your show. I can't cover the $5. And 99% of the time, you're going to get a subscription to the show. And that is long tail thinking. So a lot of what we're doing, a lot of what we're pursuing in the Innovate for Vegas Foundation revolves around this long tail, that the benefit of effort may not even come directly as a financial benefit. It may come from education, from what is learned during collaboration, meeting new people, working on new projects, new ideas. You may get a job as a result, doing something completely different, but because of a connection made, and so on and so on. So the value proposition is not immediately obvious, and it's not forced. Perhaps organic, you could say that, but it's really the value for value model. Do something good, and the rest will follow, something like that. I don't know if that's always true, but we'll see. It is possible to do this around GPL projects, so that people who think that GPL is a viral or damaging license to apply to a project are being overly sensitive to their own profit motives, perhaps, and not pondering the big picture and how their value model is composed. But that's if we're going to deep dive on that topic, it'd be great to have other people who have faced challenges trying to deploy with a GPL license to deal with. We want to build something proprietary around the Linux kernel. Well, why are you choosing the Linux kernel? Because it's free. Okay, how did it get there? So it's something to think about, certainly. So the about the XZ utils backdoor. So at the package name, if you are using Linux, probably something like XZ-utils. I know that's the Debian package name. There's a version number, and they rolled it back. So for the purposes of upgrade path, because apt is not great at rollbacks. So I believe it's version 5.1 really, and then the compromised version, which I cannot remember what it is. If I can type. Still can't type. Yes. So I have installed on my machine 5.6.1 plus really 5.4.5, which is the last version that they know was not compromised. So the actual story behind how this happened is pretty interesting and pretty telling and educational. It's a tired maintainer who was tired of doing this, probably not appreciated. A poorly vetted handoff. So somebody started making contributions, pull requests, or however they were doing it. And offer to take it over. Like, hey, you want me to be the maintainer of this? And however that exchange went, there will be more and more examination of this. There already has been. Led to the ability to slide in some extra code, some malware that was not included in the visible source. So it was inserted as a binary during the build process. So of your distribution, including Debian, from what I understand at this point, you pull the finished build. You're not building from source. You're not a lunatic like a Gentoo person. I'm just kidding. You just have a lot of spare time for building packages. So if the build process is able to take a build artifact that includes binaries or components that are not a part of the source tree, so they can't be examined quite as easily, if there's no check for that, and if that's not checked during the maintenance process, so if the maintainer becomes the what am I thinking? The villain. The maintainer becomes the villain, becomes the maintainer. So if that happens, you suddenly have a bad actor who can pretend everything is fine. Oh, the source code is here. It's still there. Look, it's still fine. But they slip in some binary machinations, and the world falls apart. And this could have been much worse. It was luckily caught by an employee at Microsoft who was benchmarking. I think it was SSH connections, but benchmarking some things and said, "Why is this taking so long?" And found that this malware was inserting effectively delay, right? So that led to examination and discovery. So that's good. Got lucky. I've posted somewhere where we seem to be excited on large language models and things like Copilot and so on, taking our jobs. They're going to replace software developers. I'm like, why don't we have these tools looking at code to find exploits and backdoors and other problems such as this? Why are we not taking if they're going to take our jobs, let's start by having them take our bugs and vulnerabilities. But everybody's so excited about getting engineers out and having code write applications that nobody understands because nobody's looking at them. Like, I don't even have to be a coder. I just have GPT write my code for me. Okay. So was it trained on XV utils by any chance? So interesting times ahead, but I think we really need to take a look at how we can use these brilliant and light speed developing technologies at examining what we have. And we can do that because of open source software. You can ask Apple to use modern tools to examine and hunt down and maybe even identify fixes for vulnerabilities in their iPhone, the iOS, or their Mac OS, or hey, what if they use these tools to find security vulnerabilities in their silicon? If their M1 design had a proper perusal, they may not have released an unfixable security problem, but that's another story. So the important parts of are these for XV. I keep saying XV, I think XZ. When the exploit was discovered, all hands on deck. Everybody kind of went, whoa, this is important. And they jumped on it. They rolled back to before the bad revision because they were able to see where the change. Okay. Oh, there it is. That's the one. Let's go back to before that. So they can roll back or otherwise release working exploited versions of these tools in their various distribution paths. Luckily, because this was reasonably new, it was appearing in unstable releases. If you're familiar with the stable testing, unstable, experimental sort of segmenting of software or Linux distribution releases. So the number of people affected was not huge, but had the exploit not been found, it would have become huge as the unstable, we just released this, became, this is now a standard part of all stable releases into the future. So if that's never found, now you have an exploit everywhere. So it could have been a lot worse. So because of the transparency of open source projects, because there are people interested in these things working, and because there are people who are listening for things like this, you're not going to email support@apple.com and get an email in a month, right? There are people who say, what? Exploit? Backdoor? You send them a link. Here's the code. Here's the situation. That gets attention. And because everyone can take a look, you now have second and third opinions, and the ball begins to roll to repair, to replace, revert. So this prevents it from spreading, but it also keeps people aware of the importance of all these processes and the participation, the attention to detail, and so on. So a bad thing, but ultimately a thing to point to. So not a good thing like, yeah, let's do this all the time, but a good thing as in, this is how this can work if we keep an eye on how this works. And we're all in this together sort of thing, right? Every time you use a piece of open source software, you have access to the sources. And if you want to become a skilled and talented contributor to any projects of any kind, and it could be the software, it could be the documentation, it could be the visualizations, it could be anything. But if you take the time to understand what is already out there, what is already working, you become better and more skilled for it. So the timeline, the personalities, even though the person that became the new maintainer was pseudonymous, is that how you say that? They have their GitHub credentials, but I don't know that they've identified the actual human being. If it was one, maybe it was a robot. The actual commits are there, so you can see when things happen. Like I said, you can revert to before. If things are done in the open, and if the distribution pipelines are visible, it's relatively easy to track down and examine the situation, to triage, to autopsy, however you want to look at postmortem. This is rarely true of closed source commercial scenarios. You'll often hear about it months later, if at all. So we're coming to the end. Why real participation is important. For our projects, for Innovate for Vegas Foundation, we used previously, especially in our Code for Vegas days when we first started, we incorporated as a Nevada nonprofit in June of 2022. So like February, March, April for sure, May, June, we were having monthly hackathons where, hey, come on down, come and join a project, come and talk about new projects, etc. Join our GitHub organization. Well, once you start doing that, first of all, you have a lot of people that lose interest and disappear. So you can't count on them. They can't start a project and then leave it sitting there. That happened. Like, what are these repositories? This person is gone, and they created a scaffold project. There's nothing in it. It's just the default init, starting files. So when you open the doors to anyone who's interested, you'll find, and this is true in general, if you look at some of the fallout of Hacktoberfest, if you look at any projects that are suffering from the pull request bombings and such, like, everybody do pull requests on that project. So the people that are working for free, who are volunteering their time, now have to deal with an influx of volunteer efforts that might be completely irrelevant. They might be pranks. They might be nefarious. Similarly, for our organization, we're having hackathons every month. Universally, people would show up, ask questions, indicate some level of interest, and disappear completely. So this becomes a time commitment, a time sink. It becomes very expensive. Time spent answering questions from people who are not actually interested is time that could be spent working with people who are interested. We need process and accountability for our projects and also for contributors to those projects. So one way that we can decide who is serious is, rather than saying join our organization and participate in this and sort of be in the in crowd, if you will. That's not really appropriate, but join and you're already in is not appropriate, because there has to be some sort of hurdle. You have to do something. So actually contribute to a project. You can do so externally, pull requests. You can participate in discussions. We have a Discord server for casual discussions. We have our discussions on GitHub per project, per repo even. So there are a number of ways to participate initially to indicate real interest. And if you can actually come through, we have our Agile for Volunteers model for it's the sort of very basic version of the original Agile without the presumption that contributors to an agile project are employees. So the time commitment is personal, not paid. The presumption is the person may need to leave, may not be in it for the long term. So it's a 2-week interval. If you can finish something that you started and you have to leave after that, what else can you ask of volunteers? But it does try to do away with, partial commitment on the personal side and then meaningless commits to the project that then are irrelevant, need to be backed out, etc. Not to mention the time spent onboarding that will never be recovered, and so on and so on. So our participation model has changed to more of a do something, then join. So contribute to a project, contribute to the specifications of a project, propose a new project, actually do something, then join the organization, because it is completely impossible to have volunteers spend all of their time on other volunteers who don't intend to be volunteers, if that makes sense. We ask for some sort of proof of life, right? Are you really interested? And someone who cannot do this or refuses to do this is probably not going to fit into this style of project development, which is volunteer-based. I myself am a volunteer. I don't make a single penny. It costs me money to be the managing director because of, we don't have donations that cover everything. And so there's, I've donated to this project time, small amounts of money. We're not talking millions of dollars. We're not even talking about thousands. We're talking about, a filing fee, which actually we did have donations for, et cetera. Early days, hopefully being somewhat reimbursed through donors and sponsors, but we'll see. But true belief means you do contribute your time, and sometimes time is money. But we do have to be cognizant that civic volunteers are volunteers, and the effort that they put in should get something out eventually, and that does not mean completely radically asymmetric contribution of time and energies from one, and then others taking advantage of that and then kicking the tires and disappearing forevermore. That's difficult to support in the long term. So all of our projects, while they are open source and we invite civic volunteers to participate, we do need to ask that people actually run with it, that actually participate, with the understanding that the work that they do as a part of a larger whole will be recognized, they will receive full attribution, and ideally, if they stick with projects and they become a part of the project team or teams in such a way as they, on an ongoing basis, become sort of a magnet for donations and other support, maybe they can benefit directly from the outside world, or maybe they participate materially in a deployment. So not only volunteering on the open source side, but maybe working on the commercial side to support that software or that project component, or whatever it is, the element, or graphics or text or QA or marketing, whatever it is. This is also a completely normal business model. So we're not doing anything untoward. We're not even doing anything very creative in that regard. Making use of open source, properly licensed, full attribution, transparent lists of contributors and from whom we draw benefit to elevate our own efforts, etc. It's a magic world in the future, and we are going to get there. You are welcome to join, but please do first a pull request and have it be accepted. Maybe do two. See what happens. Thank you, as always, for listening. Thank you for supporting our organization. We're coming up on 2 years old since we incorporated. I believe it's June 16th. I'm not looking at the date, but it's June of 2024 will be 2 years. I think it's June 16th. We'll be 2 years old. Ideally, we will have deployed our MyMuni-based platform before June. We'll see how it goes. The main person doing most of the work at this time is also doing our podcast, so he's busy. To quote a former colleague who grew up in Erfurt, East Germany, and was one of the early co-founding engineers at a company called SCM Microsystems, Detlef Jeanette was heard to say by me in a fine German accent, East German, we work 24 hours in the day and then we work at night. And Those are good words. Best said in his accent rather than mine. But there you go. Don't forget to check out our website. Don't forget to keep up with our primary publication point that will be located on our website for this audio program. Do note that Google Podcasts going away means we'll be moving over to YouTube podcasts. And should there be a live stream? Should there be video? Should there be more to the story? Probably yes. And we'll see where that goes. But thank you for your listenership. Thank you for sharing this with others. Thank you for telling everyone that we do have a nonprofit entity here in Nevada focused explicitly on civic volunteerism and community elevation through the use of innovation, through innovation. And thank you for, if you want to support us financially, that would be wonderful. You can visit our website. There's a donate button. Tax deductible. We are a fully determined 501c3 under our new name, Innovate for Vegas Foundation. All that can be provided to you if you have questions about our EIN, filing status, determination, status as an entity in the state of Nevada, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And on that note, I thank you for listening. Take care.